Alright, new camera, new lighting, new haircut, and all of this because I wanted to talk about my open source debut. So I recently contributed to open source, a real open source project for the first time, and I'm pretty excited about it. Now, on the surface, a lot of people probably don't care about this, but if you're new to open source or trying to get into open source, I wanted to share my experience and talk about the things that went well and some of the things that didn't go so well so that you can apply them to your own open source experience. And it's just a pretty spicy story in general, so let's hop in and talk about it. So setting the scene, I recently switched to NeoVim as my primary editor, and I've been working a lot more in the web development world recently, and specifically I've been using a test runner called VTest instead of something like Jest. So putting these two things together, I installed a NeoVim plugin where I could run VTest tests within my NeoVim instance. So the typical scenario where you have your test runner within your IDE. But eventually I ran into a problem where the NeoVim VTest test runner wasn't working from outside the root of the project. So in order for the test to work, I would have had to start my NeoVim instance from the project root, which wasn't always the case, specifically in mono repos where I would be like 2 levels up in the file tree and trying to run tests in a sub-project within the mono repo. So whenever I tried to run these tests from higher up, they would just fail because it wouldn't be able to find the files from where I was in the file system. So I started to get a little bit nervous because I work in a lot of mono repos, and this plugin was just not cutting it for me in a mono repo. So in the past, I always used to just complain in situations like this when I had problems with software, and I would just end up not using the software. But I recently realized, what the heck? I'm a software engineer. This is an open source project. I can just contribute and fix it, which is like the most primitive idea behind open source software, but I was just never actually contributing to open source software and fixing issues that I ran into. But that mindset, that was the old me. I don't think like that anymore. We're gonna fix this and get this working in mono repos. So the first thing I had to do was get the plugin running locally so that I could reproduce the issue, make changes, make the fix, and do all of that with a faster feedback loop. So starting off was pretty clear. I forked the repo and then cloned it locally so that I could work from the fork and then push to it as well. Now I did notice the project had unit tests, so I was hoping that I could reproduce the issue in a unit test and fix it from there rather than having to use the plugin in my actual NeoVim config, which I wasn't sure how to do. But unfortunately, whenever I would run the test script, it just wouldn't work. And keep in mind, this was my first time ever doing anything with NeoVim plugin development, so maybe the fix was straightforward, but I did not know how to get these tests running at first. So unfortunately, I did have to figure out how to actually run the NeoVim plugin locally, which thankfully was pretty straightforward, and it was supported with my existing package manager. So now that I had everything running locally, it was time to try and reproduce the issue in a simple environment. And conveniently, the plugin already had an example directory that had VTest set up, which was really the perfect place to try and reproduce this issue. So I added setup files to the example VTest config, pointing to a relative file. So I expected that the setup file would get picked up if I was running NeoVim from the VTest project root. But if I ran NeoVim from another level up in the file tree, then the setup file wouldn't be found and the test would fail. But before I was able to reproduce that, I actually ran into a completely separate issue. And that was that this plugin was looking for a config file named vtest.config, but the current config file was named vt.config. And according to the VTest docs, VTest should support both. So I was thinking, maybe I should fix that too while I'm here. But for now, I decided to just rename the file to vtest.config so that I could reproduce the issue, which did indeed work. I was able to reproduce, so running NeoVim from a folder up from where the VTest project lived, and attempting to run the test, the setup file wasn't found and the test could not be run. So next up was the fun part, the part where legends are made, legacies are created, and that is fixing the issues. And even better, other than configuring my NeoVim config, I've never really written my own line of Lua code in my entire life. Now the first thing I noticed was that the plugin had an option for overriding the command working directory. So what I was thinking is we could override the command working directory with whatever the path is to the vtest config file. So just to verify this idea, I decided to hard code the command working directory and see if it would work. And that did indeed work. So at first I was pretty excited about this. So all we had to do was figure out how to set the right command working directory based on where the vtest config was located. But it just didn't feel like the right solution. Because what if projects out there using VTest were changing their VTest configs with the expectation that they would run them outside of the project root directory. So with that idea, I was afraid that this change, with changing the command working directory, wouldn't really be backwards compatible with existing vtest configs out there. So even though it might work for me, it probably won't work for everyone. So with that in mind, again, I decided to take a step back and instead look at the code for the sibling Jest plugin to see what they were doing, because I have used the Jest plugin as well, and I knew that did work in mono repos. And to clarify my suspicion that setting the command working directory was not the right solution, I noticed the Jest plugin was not setting the command working directory. And that's when I noticed that there were two fundamental differences between how Jest and vtest set where tests are run from. So NeoVim plugins aside, Jest run tests from wherever the Jest config is defined, plus whatever the root dir config option is. Where vtest, on the other hand, runs tests from whatever the terminal command working directory is, plus whatever the root config option is. So overall, the NeoVim vtest plugin was working according to how vtest is supposed to work. So in that case, this isn't really something that the plugin should solve, and is just the way things are supposed to work in vtest. So I felt pretty content with that discovery, and now that I understood how vtest was determining the root directory, I realized that I could just set the root config option to the special dir name global to ensure that my vtest root is always the directory of where my vtest config lives. And again, this is probably the more appropriate solution because it lines up with how vtest actually works. So in the end, my day was kind of ruined because I wasn't going to make my first open source contribution. Turns out there was really nothing to fix, and all I had to do was change my vtest config. So dang, that was pretty much it. Or was it? This plugin was looking for a config file named vtest.config, but the current config file was named vt.config. And according to the vtest docs, vtest should support both. It was time to shift gears and add support for the vt.config file. So back to reproducing, I was able to reproduce the vt.config file not getting picked up. Then it was time to get into fixing. I dug into the code. I was able to find where the vtest config was getting picked up. So I updated the glob to pick up the vt.config file in addition to the vtest config file. And I updated the following code to return the vt.config file if it was found. And back to our goal, we want to align with how vtest actually works. So following the precedence rules called out in the vtest docs, I adjusted the code so that the vtest config file takes precedence over the vt config file. So I went ahead and manually tested these changes and they worked. The vt config file was picked up. Now that I verified the fix, I decided to refactor the code a little bit, make it much more fun and intuitive, and overall, I felt pretty good about it. But for my first open source contribution, I really didn't want to have any friction. And I also wanted to be super confident about these changes. And without writing any tests for this new behavior, I was probably going to get steamrolled on the PR, and I wasn't very confident that all the scenarios work and all of the precedence rules worked. There was no automatic regression on these changes whenever future changes come in to the plugin. And worst case scenario, the plugin maintainer would have to go in and manually test it. And it's a pretty common talking point that it's pretty rough out there for open source maintainers sometimes. So I had to get these tests running locally, and I had to make sure that I had tests for my changes. So I still had issues trying to get the test to run, but did some research on whatever this Lua test runner was and eventually got it working. And now came the hard part. How was I going to test my changes? And this was especially tricky because I knew that my changes directly interfaced with the file system. So I was a little bit hesitant to write a test against the file system, but looking further into the test, I realized that they're not really unit tests. They're more like end-to-end tests, or I guess integration tests in this case. I don't really know. Whatever you want to call it. But anyways, yeah, I decided that we should definitely have these tests interact with the file system so that we have the most confidence that the plugin is actually working in a real environment. So these tests were actually run against the example project that we had tried out earlier, but I didn't want to completely clutter this example project. So I created a config directory within the example project, which contained a bunch of different subfolders with different vt and vtest config setups. And with that, I was able to write a couple tests that made sure the vt config file got picked up, the vtest config file got picked up, and that the vtest config file had precedence over the vt config file. And I was able to use these changes in the example project for manual testing too, which at this point didn't really matter. But it was nice to make sure it really worked just as a sanity check. So with that, we were all good. I committed the changes, pushed those up to my fork, opened up a PR to the plugin from my fork, wrote up a nice PR description. That's one of my pet peeves at work too. I really like to have good PR descriptions that talk about things like the description, the motivation behind the change, as well as how the change was tested. So this was a win. We opened up a PR, but at this point, all I could do was wait. So the next morning I woke up, checked my email right away to see if my PR had been merged, and it actually was. And even better, I got a nice little appreciation comment for actually writing tests. So I was really excited with how fast that got merged. Not that my change was very big at all. That was a really small change, so I guess that was expected. But overall, that was a good first issue for me. I haven't worked with Lua much, haven't done much open source in general, and it was a small issue that was clearly an issue, which leads us into the takeaways here. So these are things that you can apply to your own open source journey. So the first thing is to go in with an open mind. So don't force it, because you might find something else that's actually an issue along the way. And we saw that exact scenario here. So I went in thinking I was going to fix this plugin in terms of making it work in Monero repos. Turns out that wasn't even an issue, but instead we found another issue where the Vite config file wasn't getting picked up. The second takeaway here is that the best open source projects to contribute to are open source projects that you actually use. There's a higher chance that you understand the domain that you're working in and understand the system as a whole that you're trying to contribute to. So this kind of goes back to the idea of not forcing it. Let those open source problems come to you through the open source software that you use. And this depends too, right? I think this is good advice for people who are new or getting into open source, because it can be really overwhelming and probably doesn't make sense anyways to try and search out an open source project to contribute to that you don't even use, and then try and fix issues in that project that you're not even familiar with. And the last takeaway here is just a summary of the steps I went through and the steps I'm going to go through on future open source contributions. So use open source software, find the issues in that software, fork the repo, get it running locally, reproduce the issue locally, try and fix it with tests, maybe even test-driven development, whatever you feel like. Open a PR from your fork, write a stellar PR description, and then simply wait and try and get it merged. So thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed this story, and hopefully these takeaways inspired you and are something you can apply to your next or first open source contribution.